Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to a place you might not expect.
Mm.
Okay, so imagine this tiny island
Yeah.
in the South Pacific. It even has a nickname, Le Caillou,
Oh.
which is French for the pebble. And it really is stunning, strategically important, and loaded with nickel. Sounds pretty peaceful, right?
Yeah.
Well, not exactly. This pebble is New Caledonia, and it's caught in the middle of a global tug-of-war.
Right.
Because you see, it's a French territory.
All right.
But a lot of the indigenous Kanak people, they want independence.
Yeah.
And we're going to break all of that down today, but to help us understand this complicated situation,
Right.
we've got Colonel Carlos Ojeda, our expert on geopolitical strategy. So together we'll dive into the history, the players, and the really high stakes involved, not just for France and New Caledonia,
Right.
but for global powers like China, too. And one of the most surprising things we found in our research was how much the voter turnout actually changed between the independence referendums.
Mm.
It really shows you how much passion and controversy there is surrounding this issue. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's just start with the basics. Where exactly is New Caledonia? And why should anyone on the other side of the world even care about what's happening there?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? New Caledonia sits just east of Australia, and that location by itself already makes it strategically valuable. But it gets even more interesting when you factor in its exclusive economic zone.
Easy.
Right.
Yeah.
We're talking about a huge area of ocean, 1.4 million square kilometers,
Wow.
that New Caledonia has rights to when it comes to things like fishing and any potential resources like oil and gas.
Yeah.
And on top of all of that, it's got a huge amount of the world's nickel reserves.
So this tiny island is a real powerhouse when it comes to resources.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned this easy a couple of times.
Yeah.
For our listeners who aren't quite up on our maritime law, can you break down why this easy is so important, especially in this whole independence debate?
Yeah, absolutely. Control over resources is a major part of any independence movement. And in New Caledonia's case, controlling that massive EEZ means controlling a ton of potential wealth.
Right.
If they become independent, they'd have the power to decide who gets to explore and exploit those resources. That's a major bargaining chip on the global stage.
So it's not just about political independence, it's about economic independence as well.
Exactly.
So we've got this strategically important island loaded with valuable resources and a population divided on who should be in control. Let's get into that struggle for independence a bit more. This isn't something new, though, is it? New Caledonia has a history of unrest and calls for independence.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Things really boiled over in the 1980s, culminating in a violent uprising that lasted from 1984 to 1988.
Wow.
And that period of conflict eventually led to the Matignon Accords in 1988, which tried to bring some peace and grant New Caledonia a bit more autonomy. But the story doesn't end there. Just 10 years later, in 1998, the Noumea Accord was signed, marking a really big step forward. Not only did it transfer even more power to New Caledonia in areas like education, health, and labor, but it also recognized the Kanak identity and its significance, both culturally and politically.
Okay.
And probably most importantly, it set the stage for up to 3 referendums on independence.
Ah, the referendums. Those were really make-or-break moments for the independence movement, right? What can you tell us about them?
Well, the results are complicated. In the first one, held back in 2018, 56.7% voted to stay with France.
Okay.
Then in 2020, that dipped just a bit to 53.3%. Still a no, but the margin was shrinking.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where things get really interesting. By the time the third referendum happened in 2021, voter turnout had plummeted, with only 43.87% of eligible voters actually taking part. Of those who did vote, a huge 96.5% chose to stay with France.
Okay, now that interesting. It almost sounds like support for staying with France actually went up in that last referendum, but with way fewer people voting. What happened there?
That's where the controversy comes in. See, the pro-independence groups boycotted the 2021 referendum. They said the COVID pandemic had made it impossible to campaign properly, so the whole thing was illegitimate. And this boycott, along with a rule called the frozen electorate, really made tensions worse.
Hold on, frozen electorate. What's that all about?
So it basically means that only people who had been living in New Caledonia since before 1998 were allowed to vote in the referendums and even in the provincial elections. It was put in place originally to protect the voting power of the Kanak people.
I see.
They were worried about being outnumbered by newer arrivals.
So if you moved to New Caledonia after 1998, you didn't get a say in its future, even if you'd been there for years and years.
Exactly. And this has become a major sticking point. In fact, just this year, the French government tried to change the voting law. They proposed letting anyone who'd lived in New Caledonia for at least 10 years vote in provincial elections.
Okay.
But this was met with huge opposition from the pro-independence groups. They saw it as a blatant attempt to shift things in favor of staying with France.
Wow, it really seems like every single move in this has huge consequences.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the groups pushing for independence then. Who are the big players on that side?
There are three main ones. The Kanak and Socialist National Liberation Front, usually called the FLNKS, the Caledonian Union,
Okay.
and maybe the most vocal right now, the Unitary Action Committee, or UAC.
And we're back with part 2 of our deep dive into New Caledonia's push for independence. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is.
This tiny island is a focal point for, well, global powers.
Yeah.
France, the pro-independence groups, we've even got China in the mix, all vying for influence. But before we get into what the future might hold, I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier
Okay.
about those shrinking margins of victory in those referendums.
Right.
Those no votes, for independence, getting closer each time.
Oh, yeah. It's really important, isn't it? Because in that first referendum back in 2018,
Yep.
the vote to stay with France won with 56.7% of the vote. But by 2020, that number had dropped to 53.3%.
Right.
So it kind of suggests that there's a shift happening in how people are thinking. Maybe they're more open to the idea of independence,
Yeah.
even if they weren't quite ready to fully embrace it just yet.
So even though the end result was the same, those shrinking margins tell us something else is going on.
Exactly.
Maybe the opinions are evolving and there's a growing desire for change.
Absolutely. It's not a static situation at all. And then you throw in the frozen electorate and the boycott of that 2021 referendum, and you get a very nuanced and, well, dynamic situation.
No easy answers for sure.
Yeah.
But let's change gears for a second and talk about what could happen next. If violence isn't the answer, what are some nonviolent strategies these pro-independence groups could use? What can they do to make progress?
Well, they have a few options. One approach, and it's powerful, is to focus on building stronger alliances, not just within New Caledonia, but globally.
Okay.
This could be working with other indigenous groups, human rights organizations, even countries that support their cause.
So it's about amplifying their message on a global stage
Yeah,
and creating more unified front.
exactly. Applying pressure from different angles. They could also try engaging in more dialogue with the French government. Instead of just demanding full independence right away, maybe push for renegotiating the terms of their relationship, focusing on greater autonomy within the existing system.
So a push for more control over things like managing natural resources, directing economic development,
Yeah,
preserving Kanak culture.
that's a path they could take, the goal being to create more space for self-determination while still being part of the current framework.
It sounds more pragmatic, but I imagine it would require a big shift in mindset from both sides.
Oh, absolutely. It would take genuine commitment to compromise. And we have to remember, even within the pro-independence movement, there are lots of perspectives.
Right, so it's not as if everyone's on the same page here.
You're right.
They don't all agree on the best way forward.
Exactly. And that's okay. Internal debate can be a good thing. But if the pro-independence movement wants to make any real progress, they need to find a strategy that respects those different views.
So we've got building alliances, engaging in dialogue, maybe even aiming for greater autonomy. Are there any other nonviolent strategies they could use?
One that's often overlooked is economic empowerment. What if they focused on developing their own sustainable economic initiatives? Ones that directly benefit the Kanak community and help boost their self-sufficiency.
So creating their own economic base, independent of French control.
Exactly. It could mean investing in local businesses, maybe promoting ecotourism that highlights their unique culture and environment, even developing new industries that capitalize on New Caledonia's natural resources. Building their own economic strength would give them more leverage when it comes to negotiations.
Yeah.
It shows they're capable of governing themselves.
It's like playing the long game, isn't it?
Yeah.
Building from within, improving their abilities through actions, not just words.
Precisely. And this approach might actually appeal to more people, even those who aren't fully on board with complete independence.
Right.
I mean, who doesn't want a stronger, more prosperous economy?
That's a great point. It shifts the focus from this purely political fight
Yeah.
to something that includes economic well-being
Right.
and self-sufficiency. It's something everyone can support.
And that can be a powerful motivator for change. It gives people a real vision of what a more independent New Caledonia could be, a vision that connects with their everyday lives.
Okay, we've covered a lot here. Building alliances, engaging in dialogue, focusing on economic empowerment. But let's go back to that question you raised about the butterfly effect of all of this. What are the wider implications if New Caledonia does become independent?
Well, the biggest concern, and we talked about this earlier, is that China might try to step in.
Right.
New Caledonia's strategic location, all those resources,
Yeah.
it makes it very tempting for any country that wants to increase its influence in the South Pacific. And China has a history of doing just that.
We've been investing a lot in infrastructure and development projects in the region.
Right.
And often there are strings attached to those investments.
Exactly. So if New Caledonia were to become independent, it could give China a chance to gain a foothold in a region that's been, well, dominated by Western powers.
Right.
And that could have a big impact on security and stability in the region.
So it's not just about the fate of one small island. We're talking about a possible shift in the global balance of power.
That's exactly the butterfly effect we were talking about. Things that seem small happening in one part of the world can have ripple effects that change the entire geopolitical landscape. And what's happening in New Caledonia is definitely one of those things.
It really shows why it's important to understand these conflicts, even ones that seem far away. They can have real consequences for all of us.
Absolutely. And it highlights how we need to find thoughtful, nuanced solutions, ones that take into account all the complex local, regional, and global dynamics.
So what do we look out for as this situation develops? What are the key things to watch for?
I think the first thing is to see how the pro-independence movement changes. Can they agree on a clear strategy? Will they keep pushing for full independence? Or will they consider other options, like more autonomy within the French system?
It's a big question. And I'm also curious to see what happens with that frozen electorate issue.
Right.
Will France be open to more reforms, or will they resist any changes that might weaken their control?
Another important thing to watch. And of course, we can't forget about China. What will they do?
Yeah.
Will they continue expanding their influence through economics and diplomacy, or will they try a more aggressive approach?
Great points. It sounds like we'll just have to wait and see what happens next in this story.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up part 2, I want to go back to that idea of economic empowerment you mentioned.
Right. The possibility of those pro-independence groups creating their own economic base,
Yeah.
building a vision of a more self-sufficient New Caledonia.
That's an idea that could really make a difference, not just for the independence movement, but for the island's future as a whole. And I think that's a great place to transition to part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore New Caledonia's economy in more detail, its potential for growth, and how all of that might shape its path toward independence. But for now, we want to encourage you to think about everything we've discussed today and consider the complex dynamics at play in this fascinating and ever-changing situation. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into New Caledonia's quest for independence. We've covered the history, the players, the high-stakes global game,
Yeah.
and even some ideas about how they might find a peaceful way forward.
Right.
But as we head toward, well, what could be the end game here,
Yeah.
there's one big piece of the puzzle we need to look at: the economy.
You're absolutely right. You can't really talk about self-determination without talking about, well, economic self-sufficiency.
Right.
And in New Caledonia, the economy it's a bit of a paradox.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for us. I know New Caledonia has these massive nickel reserves,
Right.
but how is that actually playing out for the people who live there?
That's the question, isn't it? You see, while New Caledonia has something like 20 to 30% of the world's nickel reserves, which could make it an economic powerhouse, the benefits haven't really reached everyone,
Okay.
especially the indigenous Kanak population.
So we're seeing a situation where all this resource wealth hasn't translated into widespread prosperity.
Exactly. And that feeds right into the whole independence movement. You know, the pro-independence groups argue that you can't have real self-determination without economic control.
Right.
They say they need to make sure the benefits from those resources are shared fairly.
That makes sense. So if we're talking about a more equitable and sustainable economy for New Caledonia, what could that look like? What are some of the things they could focus on that would benefit everyone?
Well, one area with huge potential is ecotourism.
Wow.
I mean, New Caledonia has stunning natural beauty,
Yeah.
a really diverse ecosystem, and this incredibly rich cultural heritage. These are all things they could use to build a thriving tourism industry, one that benefits local
Oh,
communities,
right.
but also protects the environment.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Using the economic potential of tourism without actually harming the things that make New Caledonia so special.
Exactly. You got it. Ecotourism done right could be a win-win.
Mm.
Think about locally owned eco-lodges, tours that showcase Kanak traditions, sustainable fishing, and agriculture practices. It's a vision of a more self-reliant and resilient economy, one that works for everyone.
It's a really compelling picture, but we also know tourism can be unpredictable,
Yeah.
especially with things like, well, pandemics happening. Are there any other sectors New Caledonia could focus on to diversify and strengthen its economy?
For sure, diversification is key. They could look into sustainable aquaculture, maybe organic farming, even renewable energy production. And of course, we can't forget about all that nickel.
Right. Instead of just exporting raw nickel, they could focus on developing industries that, well, add value and create jobs in New Caledonia.
Absolutely. Think about processing plants, battery manufacturing, even high-tech industries that take advantage of nickel's unique properties. It would take investment, of course,
Yeah.
and education, training, infrastructure, but it could completely transform New Caledonia's economy and make them less dependent on just exporting raw materials.
So we're talking about a big shift in thinking, moving away from just being a resource provider and becoming a producer of actual goods and services.
Exactly. Moving up the value chain, creating an economy that's more diverse, more knowledge-based, and less vulnerable to those global ups and downs in commodity prices.
That makes a lot of sense, especially these days with all the economic uncertainty and geopolitical instability. But let's be real. Transitioning to a more sustainable and self-sufficient economy, that's no easy feat. What are some of the challenges New Caledonia might face trying to make that shift?
Well, one of the biggest is attracting investment and expertise. They'll need to create a business environment that's attractive to both domestic and foreign investors,
Okay.
but also make sure those investments benefit local people
Right.
and don't exploit the environment.
It's about walking that tightrope,
Right.
encouraging development without compromising the well-being of the people and the environment.
It really is. It's about planning, good governance, and a real commitment to transparency. Another challenge will be developing the workforce and the infrastructure. Investing in education, training programs, transportation, renewable energy sources, those are all crucial for building a modern, sustainable economy.
It's a long-term vision,
It is.
but it's one that could create a much brighter future for New Caledonia, regardless of whether they ultimately choose independence or some other path. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway here? What do you really want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is that the fight for self-determination in New Caledonia is about so much more than just politics. It's about the economy, social justice, creating a future where all New Caledonians have a chance to thrive. Whether they choose independence or some other form of self-governance, their success depends on building a strong, diverse, and sustainable economy, one that works for everyone.
It's a powerful message, and it reminds us that even in this world of complex geopolitics, it's the people on the ground who ultimately have the power to shape their own destiny.
Exactly. And as we've seen, this story in New Caledonia, it's not over yet. There are still many chapters to be written.
We'll definitely be watching to see what happens next. But for now, we encourage you to keep learning about this fascinating topic, dig deeper into what's happening in New Caledonia, and form your own opinions about what the future holds for this amazing island.
Remember, even seemingly small events can have ripple effects that touch us all. The more we understand these complex global dynamics, the better prepared we'll be to navigate our increasingly interconnected world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into New Caledonia's quest for independence. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.